She was only 6 when her trembling whisper cut through the storm, reaching a 911 operator on the other end. Through broken sobs, the little girl revealed a secret no child should ever carry, that her mother was trapped, locked inside a shed with no way out. The line crackled with static, her fear bleeding into every word. Then came another sound, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore, the desperate bark of a German shepherd. That cry in the dark would lead officers to the truth, tearing down walls of lies that had stood for years. What Rex uncovered that night was not just a rescue. It was a reckoning, an unraveling of deceit that would expose a chilling betrayal and forever alter the fate of one family. This is more than a story of survival. It is a story of loyalty, of courage carved out of fear, and of a child who clung to hope like a lifeline. But I warn you, stay with me until the end, because the final twist is not what you expect. Snow fell heavy across Maple Ridge, Minnesota, each flake like a shard of glass tumbling through the black sky. The small town, cradled between pine forests and frozen fields, lay silent, its only sounds, the crunch of tires on ice and the groan of the wind clawing across rooftops. Most homes had drawn their curtains tight, heaters humming against the cold, but not Michael Carter. Out on patrol, his cruiser slid along a back road hugging the northern woods. At 38, Michael carried himself with the kind of gravity only hardship could forge. Broad-shouldered, a little over 6 feet tall, his hair already silvering at the temples, his face mapped by lines of nights spent staring danger down. Born and raised in Maple Ridge, he knew these woods as well as his own scars. His father, a logger, had died in a mill accident when Michael was 16. From then on, he'd carried the weight of others, his voice steady, his eyes unflinching. People trusted him because he never looked away. Beside him sat his true partner, not a man, but a dog. Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose sable-black coat shimmered under the dashboard light, ears pricked, amber eyes sharp. More than trained, Rex was instinct. He was Michael's shadow, bound to him since the night 3 winters ago, when he tracked down 2 lost hikers in a blizzard. From that moment, the bond had been sealed. Michael often said Rex was the better cop, quicker, sharper, untouchable. Yet beneath the uniform, Rex gave Michael something no badge ever could: companionship in the silence. Neither of them knew, as snow lashed harder against the windshield, that tonight would demand everything they had. Because the cries of a little girl, the echo of a mother's prison, and the truth buried in the dark would drag them into a storm far greater than the one falling from the sky. And when the final door was forced open, the secret waiting inside would not just change a family. It would put Michael and Rex face to face with a choice that could cost them everything. Long nights in the car, endless calls that revealed both the cruelty and the despair of people could hollow a man. Out. Rex filled that hollow with the steady presence of loyalty, a heartbeat Michael could trust. The radio hissed softly, filling the silence with static. Michael adjusted the heater vents, rubbing his gloved hands together as the temperature outside dropped further. Then came the voice. 911, dispatch to Unit 3. We have a juvenile caller on the line. Female, approximately 6 years old. Caller reports her mother is locked in a shed on private property. The child is alone in the residence. Possible domestic endangerment. Address, Old Mill Road, Maple Ridge. Outskirts. Michael's posture stiffened instantly, his hand closed around the radio. Unit 3. Copy. En route, static answered, followed by, the operator. Be advised, caller is distraught. State stepmother is involved. Father not present. Status of victim, inside, shed unknown. The line fell quiet again. Michael's gaze shifted to Rex. The dog's ears flicked as if he too understood the weight of the call. Michael spoke low the way he always did, when he wanted Rex calm yet ready. Looks like we've got work, partner. He flicked on the sirens, though he kept them muted to a low wail. The red and blue lights burst across the trees, turning the falling snow into shards of color. The road wound deeper into the woods. Shadows of pine swayed like dark sentinels as the storm thickened. Michael's hands tightened on the wheel, mind racing. He had handled countless domestic calls before, arguments, drunken violence, bitter custody, battles. But there was something raw about a child dialing 911 inches the dead of dies. Night, 6 years old, alone, crying. Stepmother locked her in a shed. He muttered under his breath, the words tasting bitter. He could almost picture the girl, small, frightened, clutching a phone too large for her tiny hands. Yet in that fear, she had made the call. Courage, even in miniature form, could save lives. The cruiser turned onto Old Mill Road. Snow lay deeper here, unplowed, the tires sliding slightly as Michael slowed his pace. The beam of the headlights revealed the faint outline of a farmhouse ahead, its roof sagging, under frost, windows glowing faintly like the eyes of something too weary to watch. Beyond the house, half hidden by skeletal trees, stood the dark shape of a shed. Michael pulled the car to the side, killed the sirens, and sat in silence for a moment. His breath fogged the windshield. The air felt heavier here, pressed down by the weight of something unseen. Rex shifted, ears pricking forward. His body grew rigid, the tail stiff, nose twitching against the glass. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, but deep, a sound that always sent Michael's nerves on edge. Michael opened the door, the cold slapping his face like a wall of knives. He pulled his flashlight free and clicked it on, the beam scattering across the snow. Rex leapt down beside him, paused silent despite his weight. The farmhouse loomed quiet, its porch buried under snowdrifts. But Rex wasn't watching the house. His nose lifted toward the shed. His ears stood tall, his body poised as if every fiber of muscle had been strung tight. Michael followed his gaze. The shed stood silent, its boards warped and black with age. Yet from this distance, Michael could already feel it. Something wrong, something heavy in the air. Rex's growl deepened, his fur bristling along his spine. He took one step forward, then another, breath steaming like smoke from a forge. His body trembled, not with fear, but with the instinctive certainty that danger or pain lay just ahead. Michael narrowed his eyes, the beam of his flashlight sweeping the snow. They had arrived, and already Rex had sensed it. The truth was waiting in the darkness, locked behind the shed door. The cruiser's tires crunched over the frost-bitten gravel as Officer Michael Carter slowed to a stop before the farmhouse. The snow was still falling, but softer now, like the last sift of flour across a cutting board. His headlights illuminated the porch where a small figure sat huddled against the wooden rail, her body drawn inward as though she were trying to fold into herself and vanish into the night. Michael cut the engine and stepped out, boots sinking into the snow. Rex leapt, down beside him, tail stiff, ears pointed. The dog's body was a coiled spring of energy, ready to respond to whatever awaited. "Dispatch, Unit 3 on scene," Michael murmured into his radio, his breath fogging in the cold. He shut the door quietly, not wanting to startle the child. The girl looked up at the dock sound. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed red, glistening even in the faint porch light. She had a thin oval face, framed by tangled strands of light brown hair that clung to her cheeks in damp strings. Her sweater was pale blue, far, too thin for a Minnesota winter's night, and the wool had unraveled at one cuff, where her small thumb nervously picked at the thread. Her jeans were worn at the knees, and her boots, 2 sizes too big, barely clung to her feet. This was Lily Parker, just 6 years old. Despite her small frame, there was something piercing in the way she held her gaze on Michael, as though she wanted desperately to be strong, to keep herself together, though her trembling shoulders betrayed her. Michael's voice softened low and steady as he approached. "Hey there, sweetheart. My name's Officer Carter. You must be Lily." The girl nodded, her lips trembling before she found her voice. "Mom's in the shed," she whispered. Her voice cracked, tiny and thin, carried more by desperation than breath. Stepmom locked her in. She said she wouldn't let her out, but I still hear her coughing. Michael's jaw tightened. He crouched to bring himself level with the child. His frame, so broad and imposing in the uniform, shrank in that moment to meet her where she was. "You did the bravest thing, calling for help. We're here now. You're not alone." Beside him, Rex let out a short, sharp bark that echoed into the woods. The German shepherd's hackles were raised, his head whipping toward the shed. The building loomed at the edge of the yard, black against the snowy backdrop. Its wooden slats sagged inward, roof bowed under years of neglect, and on the door glinted the dull sheen of a heavy iron padlock. Rex barked again, louder this time, then lunged forward, dragging at his leash. Michael barely had time to react before the dog bounded ahead, paws kicking snow into the air. He reached the shed door and began clawing at it with fierce urgency, nails scraping wood, barking with such intensity that it shook the stillness of the night. Lily flinched at the sound, but her eyes widened with a fragile spark of hope. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly, then clutched the porch rail for balance. "You see?" she whispered, hoarsely. He knows Mom's in there. Michael's heart twisted. He lifted the radio. Dispatch, Unit 3, requesting immediate backup at Old Mill Road. Suspected unlawful confinement, possible medical emergency. Advise EMTs to stage nearby. The acknowledgement crackled back, relief mixed with urgency, in Michael's veins. He turned back to the child. Her lips were pale, her small hands shaking uncontrollably. She had been out here far too long. Michael shrugged off the thick wool blanket, folded in the back seat of his cruiser, and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric nearly swallowed her, but she clutched it tight as though it were the only anchor in the storm. Come here, Michael said gently, guiding her down the steps. The girl stumbled once in the snow, but he steadied her with a large, calloused hand. When they reached Rex, the dog paused in his frenzied scratching, just long enough to look back. His amber eyes met Lily's, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them. She knelt, despite the cold, and threw her small arms around the dog's thick neck. Rex froze, then softened, his tail wagging once, slow but certain, as he leaned into her embrace. She buried her face into his fur, whispering, "Please don't stop. Please help her." Michael stood just behind them, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the locked shed door, the padlock gleaming like a clenched fist, the sound of Rex's barks, the child's fragile frame pressed against him, and the shadow of the shed standing silent. All of it carved deep into Michael's resolve. This was no longer just a call. This was a promise. The padlock shrieked as the bolt cutters bit down. The metal groaned, resistant at first, until a sharp crack split the night air. The lock dropped into the snow with a dull thud, and Rex barked triumphantly, his body quivering with urgency. Michael's gloved hands gripped the door handle. He inhaled once, steadying himself. Behind him, Lily clung to the blanket draped over her shoulders, wide eyes fixed on the shed as though her life hinged on what lay within. Snowflakes tumbled through the air, catching in her tangled hair. But she didn't move, didn't blink. With a forceful pull, the warped door creaked open. The hinges shrieked in protest, releasing a gust of air so cold and stale it burned the back of Michael's throat. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow, cluttered space. Broken tools hung from nails in the wall. Cardboard boxes sagged under dampness. And in the far corner, a shape stirred. Anna Parker. Michael's voice rang firm, though beneath it throbbed urgency. On the concrete floor lay a woman, her body curled tight against the travel, cold, as though she tried to shrink away from suffering. Her frame was slender to the point of frailty, every bone sharp against pale skin that bore the waxy cast of exhaustion. Her black hair, once long and lustrous, was now tangled and matted with sweat. Lines of fatigue cut deep into her face, though she could not have been more than her mid-30 seconds. Her lips were cracked, her breaths shallow, uneven, as though each inhale might be her last. This was Anna Parker, mother of Lily. Once a warm, lively woman, known around town for her gentle smile, she was now reduced to a trembling shadow of herself. She had lived with a heart condition since her late 22nd, something she managed with strict medication. But without her pills, without food or care, the illness had sunk its claws into her body. Rex was the first to move. The German shepherd dashed inside, paws sliding slightly on the slick floor. He circled Anna once, twice, then lay down against her side, pressing his thick coat to her body. A low whine rumbled in his throat as he nuzzled her arm, the heat from his body seeping into her chilled skin. Anna stirred faintly at the contact. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dull gray. Green eyes clouded with weakness. Her cracked lips parted, and the faintest whisper slipped out. "Lee." The little girl broke. She sprinted forward, dropping the blanket into the snow, her tiny boots clattering against the wooden floor. "Mom," she cried, voice high and breaking. She threw herself to the ground beside Anna, clutching her mother's hand. The fingers were limp, cold, but they twitched slightly under her grasp. Anna tried to lift her head, but failed. Still, a faint smile flickered on her lips at the sight of her daughter. Michael crouched, keeping his voice calm even as his pulse raced. He pulled his radio again. "Dispatch, we have one female victim. Severe hypothermia, possible cardiac distress. Send EMTs to the scene immediately." As he spoke, the crunch of hurried footsteps approached from behind. Another cruiser had arrived, its red and blue lights slicing through the storm. Officer Daniel Hayes, Michael's longtime partner, strode into the yard. Hayes was a tall man in his early 40s, built like an oak tree with a square jaw lined by 2 days of stubble. His eyes were steel blue, sharp and unyielding. A man hardened by years of dealing with the darker sides of humanity. He had served 2 tours overseas before joining the force, and though he rarely spoke of it, the quiet weight he carried in his shoulders told the story. He caught sight of Anna and exhaled a curse under his breath. "Good God!" Before Michael could respond, another voice pierced the night, a high, trembling pitch that carried a touch too much theatrics. What's going on here?" Everyone turned. At the edge of the porch stood a woman wrapped in a long fur, trimmed coat that glistened under the snow. She had striking auburn hair, meticulously styled, and her lips painted crimson, despite the late hour. Her posture was flawless, shoulders straight, chin lifted, though her wide eyes darted nervously between the officers. This was Valerie Morgan, Anna's stepsister by law, and Lily's stepmother by circumstance. To neighbors, she was polished, sociable, the type who brought overly sweet pies to church potlucks and smiled just a bit too wide. But behind that veneer, her reputation carried whispers, sharp words overheard, strange tempers hidden behind closed doors. Now she pressed a manicured hand against her chest, voice quivering. "Anna, she's been sick. She locks herself away when she gets like this. I didn't know it was so bad, I swear." Michael rose to his full height, towering over her with the authority of his badge and his sheer presence. His dark brows drew together as he studied her. "She locked herself in, did she?" he asked flatly, his tone carrying an edge. His flashlight beam swept deliberately across the heavy padlock that lay broken in the snow. Valerie's eyes flickered just for a second before her painted smile reappeared. "She has episodes," she insisted, her voice tight. "She imagines things. She doesn't. I know what she's doing sometimes." Behind her, Hayes folded his arms. The gesture was small but cutting, a wall of skepticism written in every line of his face. His military background had honed his sense for deceit, and everything about Valerie's performance rear of it. Meanwhile, Lily ignored the adults entirely. She pressed her cheek against her mother's hand, tears streaming down her face, soaking into the cracks of Anna's skin. Rex shifted closer, his great head resting across Anna's chest, the steady thump of his heartbeat offering what little warmth and stability he could give. "Stay with me, Mom," Lily whispered fiercely, her small voice carrying more strength than her frame should have allowed. "Don't leave." "Me." Anna blinked weakly, her lips twitching as though she wanted to respond, but couldn't summon the breath. Michael's gaze softened as he crouched back down, placing a steadying hand on Lily's shoulder. "She's hanging on, thanks. And to you. Help is on the way." Behind them, Valerie gave a faint, exasperated laugh that tried too hard to sound casual. "This is all blown out of proportion. Anna always makes people worry. She stopped abruptly when she noticed Hayes staring at her with eyes like chips of ice, the kind of look that stripped away every false layer. Michael's stare soon joined his partner's, cold and sharp. Both men, silently but clearly broadcasting the same truth. They didn't believe her. The shed door was left ajar, its hinges moaning in the wind as EMTs carefully lifted Anna onto a stretcher. Her breathing was ragged, her skin pallid, but her pulse still fought stubbornly, beneath the pressure of the oxygen mask pressed against her face. One of the EMTs, a stocky man named Jacob Mills, broad-shouldered with a weathered face and a thick brown beard, spoke quickly to Michael as they secured Anna. His voice was brisk, no nonsense. The tone of a man who had seen too many emergencies to waste a second. Severe. Hypothermia, malnutrition, cardiac instability. She's on the edge, but she's hanging in there. We'll stabilize her en route. His eyes lingered briefly on Lily before softening. "She's lucky," someone called. The team carried Anna toward the ambulance, their boots crunching heavily in the snow. Lily watched with wide eyes, arms wrapped around Rex as though he were her only anchor. Her small frame trembled, but she didn't cry this time. She only pressed her face into the German shepherd's fur, letting his warmth swallow her fear. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "She's safe now. You did the right thing, Valerie." Standing on the porch with her coat wrapped tightly around her let out a brittle laugh that clanged against the silence. "Oh, for heaven's sake. She just overexerted herself. You're making this into some sort of melodrama." Anna's always been weak. Her words earned her. Nothing but sharp glances. Hayes muttered under his breath. Weak doesn't explain a padlock. Michael ignored her for the moment and guided Lily gently toward the house. Come inside. Let's get you warm. The kitchen was dim and cold, lit only by the faint yellow of an overhead bulb that flickered against the chipped paint of the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old cooking oil, stale as if no meal had been properly cooked here in weeks. The table, scarred with scratches and water rings, bore evidence of neglect, an empty bowl crusted with rice, a bent spoon, and scattered crumbs that seemed older than the day. Michael settled Lily into a chair and retrieved a thermal blanket from Hayes. He wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it close. Better? She nodded mutely, her cheeks blotched red from the cold. Then, after a long pause, she reached toward the table, her small fingers fumbling with a stack of crumpled papers hidden beneath. A chipped wooden tray. Michael raised an eyebrow. What do you have there? Lily's lower lip trembled. She hesitated, then slowly slid the papers free. They were torn sheets of lined notebook paper, smudged with graphite, edges curled and stained. Each page carried drawings, shaky, uneven lines that only a child could produce. But the bother, images were unmistakable. A small wooden shed drawn over and over. Always the same, always with a heavy black rectangle drawn across the door. A padlock scribbled thick and furious. Pencil strokes. Inside the shed, in every drawing, was a frail stick figure curled on the ground. Michael's throat tightened. He crouched beside her. You drew these? She nodded. Her voice was so soft he had to lean close to catch it. So I wouldn't forget. So someone would know. Hayes stepped nearer, his jaw hardening. He had seen war zones, yet the quiet desperation in these sketches hit harder than any battlefield. Michael turned the page. Another drawing showed a thin hand, stretching through a crack in the door. Outside, drawn with tiny scribbles, was a smaller hand offering something round. Bread? Michael asked gently. Lily nodded again, her small voice cracked. I pushed pieces through the gap. She was hungry. If I didn't, she would. She trailed off, unable to finish. Rex gave a soft whine, nosing against her arm as if to remind her she wasn't alone. Michael kept his voice steady. You were very brave, Lily. You helped your mom stay alive. From the corner of the kitchen, Valerie's scoff sliced through the fragile silence. Oh, don't be. Ridiculous. Children draw strange things all the time. You're going to build a case out of doodles. Her smile was sharp, her painted lips stretching too thin. Hayes didn't answer her. Instead, his eyes darted toward Rex. The German shepherd had left Lily's side and was circling the cabinets, his tail rigid, nose pressed hard to the floor. He sniffed, snorted, then pawed at the bottom drawer beneath the sink. Michael's instincts sharpened. What is it, boy? Rex barked once, short and insistent, then sat squarely in front of the drawer, his dark eyes fixed on it, his ears pricked forward, body tense with certainty. Michael moved to the cabinet, tugged the drawer open. At first, it looked empty, only dust and a scattering of crumbs, but wedged behind the thin plywood backing were small, familiar packages. He pulled them out one by one, empty blister packs, dozens of them. The silver foil was punctured where pills had once been pressed out, but the cardboard boxes were missing. He turned one over in his gloved hand. Heart medication, the very kind Anna would have needed to survive. He set them on the counter in a grim row. These should have been with her. For the first time, Valerie's painted smile faltered. She stepped forward quickly, her words tripping over themselves. She must have hidden them herself. She's always been dramatic, always wanting attention. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Michael's eyes narrowed. His voice was calm, but steel threaded every word. A woman dying alone in a locked shed isn't drama. And your stepdaughter hiding bread in her pockets isn't imagination. These drawings? He tapped the papers still on the table. These are evidence. Valerie's chin lifted defiantly, but her gaze flicked nervously toward the pills, then the drawings, then the dog, who sat like a silent sentinel, watching her every move. Hayes crossed his arms. Funny thing about children, they don't invent padlocks. And dogs don't lie about what they smell. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the soft scratching of Rex's claws against the worn linoleum as he shifted closer to Lily, placing himself between her and Valerie. Lily clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her small face pale but resolute. She reached for the drawing again, her tiny fingers trembling as she pressed it flat against the table. In the child's unsteady pencil strokes, in the empty pill packs, in the watchful growl deep in Rex's throat, the truth was beginning to assemble itself, piece by fragile piece. And in that dim, cold kitchen, Michael knew without doubt, Valerie had locked Anna away, starved her, stolen her medicine, and tried to silence the only witness. The Parker farmhouse no longer sat in silence. The night air carried with it murmurs, the shuffle of boots over snow, and the cautious voices of neighbors who had wandered close, drawn by the flashing lights, and the rumors swirling like smoke. Valerie Morgan stood on the porch, her fur-lined coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. Snowflakes clung to her auburn hair, and her painted lips trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer strain of maintaining her act. She held her chin high, voice shrill with indignation. "This is absurd," she declared, arms folded. "The child is making things up. Children are imaginative, prone to fantasy. Lily doesn't understand what she saw, what she drew. You're all taking the words of a 6-year-old as if they were gospel." Her laugh rang hollow in the frigid air. Michael Carter stood, firm at the base of the steps, his tall frame, a barrier between Valerie and the small figure, clinging to Rex's thick fur. His steely eyes were unflinching. "The drawings show more truth than you realize," he said quietly, but with a weight that carried across the yard. From the edge of the property, a voice spoke, hesitant yet certain. I heard it too. All eyes turned toward the figure of Martha Green, a woman in her late 50s, bundled in a long, quilted coat. Her hair, a crown of wiry gray, curls escaping beneath her knitted cap. Her face was lined not only with age, but with years of labor. Her family ran the small diner in town. Martha was known as the type who listened more than she spoke, someone whose words carried weight because she saved them for when they mattered. She stepped forward, boots crunching. "I walked past here most evenings on my way to check our hens, and more than once I heard coughing, ragged, painful coughing. And once I thought I heard someone whispering, 'Help!'" Valerie's smile froze, brittle as glass. "Oh, Martha, you know Anna's mind isn't right. She hallucinates. She screams for no reason. I told you that myself." But Martha's steady gaze didn't waver. "What I heard wasn't madness, it was suffering." Another neighbor shuffled closer, a tall, gaunt man with a salt and pepper beard and shoulders stooped from years of carpentry. His name was Caleb Moore, known for his quiet demeanor and calloused hands that seemed perpetually dusted with sawdust. He cleared his throat, voice growly. "I fix fences for the Morgan sometimes," he said, eyes narrowing at Valerie. "Last week, I was patching the gate when I thought I heard banging from the shed. Asked Valerie about it. She told me Anna was throwing a tantrum and that it was best to ignore her." He shook his head, jaw tight. "But what I heard wasn't tantrum. It was someone trying to get out." A third voice chimed in, softer, belonging to Sarah Lopez, a young mother. In her 30s, with long black hair tucked under a wool hat. She held her toddler in her arms, bundled so tightly only. Round cheeks peeked out. Sarah's eyes, dark and troubled, met Michael's. "My kitchen window faces this property. Sometimes at night I hear crying. I thought it was Lily, so small and alone. But now," she swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Now I think it was Anna." The weight of testimony pressed heavy into the night. Valerie's face stiffened, the crimson on her lips now stark against her paling skin. She turned sharply toward Lily, who still huddled close to Rex, her small body wrapped in the thick blanket Michael had given her. Valerie's heels struck the porch planks sharply as she descended, her painted smile stretched thin, words laced with false sweetness. "Lee, darling, tell them the truth. You just got confused, didn't you? Tell them you were only playing pretend." She reached out a hand, long, nails gleaming under the light. The response came not from the child, but from the German shepherd. Rex's body surged upward in an instant, placing himself between Lily and Valerie, his ears pinned back, lips curling to reveal, white teeth glinting in the dark. A low growl thundered from his chest, deep and primal, vibrating through the snow. When Valerie took another step forward, Rex barked once sharp, explosive, a sound that rattled even hardened officers. Valerie froze, her face twisting with indignation. "Call your dog off." But Michael didn't move. His eyes were cold steel. He knows who needs protecting. Lily, trembling, buried her face into Rex's mane, tiny fingers gripping tight to his collar. The dog stood tall, a sentinel carved of muscle and loyalty, his tail rigid, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on Valerie. Michael straightened, his voice carrying above the murmurs of the crowd. This child is not lying. These neighbors are not lying. The evidence in that kitchen is not lying. He paused, scanning the circle of faces illuminated by the red, blue lights. Martha's gray eyes, Caleb's clenched jaw, Sarah's trembling hands. Around her child, all spoke of quiet courage, of truth stepping forward despite fear. Then he turned back to Valerie, his gaze unwavering. You can dismiss words as fantasy. You can sneer at drawings, but you cannot silence what we've seen tonight, and you will not silence this child. Valerie's chest rose and fell, sharp breaths cutting the cold. Her eyes darted from face to face, but everywhere she turned, she met suspicion, doubt, even quiet anger. The power of her facade was slipping, crumbling under the weight of testimony and the growl of a dog who would not yield. Lily lifted her head, her voice fragile but clear, the kind of voice that cut through lies. Mommy didn't lock herself in. Valerie did, and I saw it. The night fell into a heavy silence. Only the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the weight of truth into the dark. Michael placed a steadying hand on Lily's small shoulder. His words were calm but final. Then that's where we begin. The investigation would go deeper. No denial, no polished lies, no theatrical smiles could turn it back. The voice of a child and the loyalty of a dog had already opened the door. The farmhouse groaned under the weight of the storm, its boards shuddering against the wind. Inside, the once quiet rooms now bustled with movement, officers combing corners with flashlights, boots thewing against creaky floorboards, the low murmur of radios relaying every discovery. Michael Carter moved like a shadow through the dim hallways, his eyes sharp, his instincts sharpened by years of searching for truths hidden in plain sight. Tonight, every detail mattered, every object could speak. Beside him padded Rex, the German shepherd's paws silent on the warped wood, his ears swiveled with each sound, his nose twitching as he sniffed the stale air. His amber eyes glowed with intensity, the kind that had uncovered more than one secret in the past. Tonight, Michael trusted those eyes more than any human witness. The shed had been the first focus. Officer Hayes directed 2 younger patrolmen to sweep the interior. The beam of their lights cut across the cold cement floor, illuminating the chilling evidence. A wooden chair sat against the wall, its legs scarred by deep grooves. When Hayes leaned closer, he saw the faint mark, circling the arms and back rope burns, carved by bindings that had bitten into the wood. On the floor below, in the thin layer of dust, lay 2 parallel lines etched deep, the tracks of rope dragged harshly across concrete. One officer lifted his camera, the flash searing briefly against the shadows. Restraints, Hayes muttered, his voice low but resolute. She wasn't just left in here, she was tied down, on a shelf behind rusted jars and toolboxes. They uncovered a small tin box. Inside were empty pill bottles, labels torn, their caps smeared with dust. The faded print still revealed the truth cardiac medication prescribed to Anna Parker. Dozens of bottles, all drained. Hayes carried the box out into the snow, his square jaw tight. She had the medicine. It was here all along. Michael's gut twisted. He turned toward the house, his eyes narrowing at the warm light flickering in the windows. Let's see. What else she's hiding? The living room was a museum of neglect. The wallpaper, peeled at the seams, furniture sagged under the weight of years, and yet an odd attempt at elegance remained. An ornate rug spread across the center, its crimson threads doled with dirt. Valerie stood stiffly near the fireplace, arms folded across her fur-trimmed coat, lips pressed tight. Her face was pale now, stripped of its earlier bravado. She flinched when Rex entered the room, his nose immediately lowering to the rug. The shepherd paced in circles, sniffing, tail stiff. Then he stopped at the edge of the rug, paws digging at the fringe. He let out a low bark, sharp and insistent. Michael stepped forward. What is it, boy? Rex clawed at the fibers until the rug curled back, revealing the bare floor beneath. There, half buried, in dust, was a small iron key ring. Michael crouched and lifted it, his gloved fingers curling around the cold metal. The keys jingled faintly, a heavy padlock key among them. Hayes stepped closer, recognition hardening his features. That'll fit the shed. Michael's gaze rose to Valerie, her face drained of color, her painted lips trembling. For once, she had no words. The silence was broken only by the metallic snap of handcuffs. Another officer stepped forward, pulling Valerie's arms behind her. She twisted, sputtering, her polished mask finally cracking. "You can't do this! She's hysterical. Anna's always been hysterical. None of you understand." But the words rang hollow against the heavy hush of the house. The neighbors outside, gathered in clusters under the swirling snow, turned their faces away from her. Valerie's fury faltered into fear as she was led toward the door. Her eyes darted once toward Lily, who clung to Rex's neck with tiny, determined fingers. The child met her gaze, not with fear now, but with the quiet defiance of someone who had survived. At the threshold of the house, another figure appeared. He had been absent through the chaos, hiding in the edges of his own denial. Now he stepped forward, snow dusting his shoulders, his eyes hollow. Thomas Parker was a man of 40, tall and once robust. Though his frame had softened with years of sedentary work, his dark hair was receding at the temples, his face square but drawn with fatigue. His hazel eyes were dulled, shadowed by guilt he could no longer ignore. He wore a flannel shirt under a heavy coat, the kind of attire of a man who once prided himself on simple, steady routines. But tonight, he looked nothing like the dependable father he imagined himself to be. Tonight, he looked broken. He stumbled, slightly as he entered, his voice catching in his throat. I didn't know." His gaze darted between the officers, the neighbors, his daughter clinging to the dog. "She told me Anna was sick, that she needed to be left alone. She said Lily exaggerated things, I believed. Her." Thomas's hands shook as he reached out, but Lily turned away, burying her face into Rex's mane. The rejection struck him harder than any blow. His voice fractured. "God forgive me, I let her do this. I didn't see what was right in front of me." Michael's expression was stern, but not unkind. He had seen men crumble under the weight of regret before. He knew the difference between guilt born of malice and guilt born of blindness. Still, the consequences remained. Hayes's tone was blunt. "Your silence gave her room to act. Now your wife lies in a hospital bed, and your daughter carries scars. No, child," Thomas swayed as though struck, his broad shoulders folding inward. He sank onto the worn sofa, burying his face in his hands. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the space between his fingers. Outside, storm howled on, snow lashing against the glass. Inside, the truth lay heavy. Ropes on a chair, empty pill bottles, keys hidden beneath the rug. The curtain had lifted. The crime could no longer be denied. And in the center of it all, a German shepherd stood tall, his amber eyes watching, his presence the silent reminder that no secret could stay buried forever. The hospital room was awash in white, the walls, the crisp linens, the sterile light that hummed faintly above. Yet within its silence, there was life. The shallow rhythm of a heart monitor kept time with each fragile breath Anna Parker drew. She lay, propped against thin pillows, her hair brushed back, though still matted with exhaustion. Her cheeks, once ghostly, pale, now held the faintest flush of returning warmth. The oxygen tube curved delicately beneath her nose, lifting with each inhale. Though her frame was frail, her eyelids fluttered with more strength than the night before. Beside the bed, perched on the chair far too big for her, was Lily. Her small hands clutched her mother's as though letting go would mean losing her forever. The girl's hair, still tangled from the storm, spilled across her cheeks, damp with tears that had not yet dried. But her eyes, those wide hazel eyes, held a resilience far beyond her 6 years. "Mom," she whispered, voice breaking but determined, "I'm not scared anymore." Anna's eyes opened slowly, clouded but brightening as they settled on her daughter. Her lips parted, dry but curved in the faintest smile. She squeezed Lily's hand weakly, a promise written in touch rather than words. At the foot of the bed, Thomas Parker stood, his broad frame crumpled beneath the weight of guilt. His dark hair, usually combed with pride, now hung limp, and his hazel eyes brimmed with tears he could not contain. The lines on his face, once hidden beneath the quiet routine of his life, were carved deeper now, etched by realization, by failure, by regret. He dropped to his knees, hands trembling as they covered his face, his voice cracked open, raw, and unguarded. "Anna, Lily, forgive me. I was blind. I let her poison me with lies. I let my pride, my trust in appearances bury the truth, and it nearly cost me everything I love. His shoulders shook as he bowed his head to the cold linoleum floor. If you can give me even a chance, I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Lily turned, watching her father, her small brow furrowed, confusion wearing with pain. But when she looked back to her mother, Anna's hand brushed weakly against her hair, guiding her gaze with a mother's steady calm. Anna's eyes glistened, not with accusation, but with something gentler sorrow and fragile forgiveness. A light too faint to blind, but too true to ignore. Outside the room, Officer Michael Carter leaned against the pale walls of the corridor. His tall frame seemed carved in shadow, his dark jacket still dusted with remnants of snow. His eyes, usually sharp with the clarity of duty, softened as he gazed through the glass pane into the family within. He had seen many endings, too many that ended in loss, in silence, in graves dug beneath frost. But this was different. Here, the arc bent toward survival, toward truth, clawing its way into the light. Rex lay stretched across the threshold of the door, his sable coat gleaming under the sterile glow. His ears flicked at each sound, but his head rested calmly against his paws. He was watchful, not restless, a guardian, who knew the battle was over, yet refused to surrender his post. Michael lowered his hand, brushing it briefly across the shepherd's fur. "Good work, partner," he murmured. The dog's amber eyes lifted steady, and for a moment man and animal shared the quiet triumph of "it's justice done." The night bled into morning, the storm finally silenced. Across Maple Ridge, snow lay still and unbroken, glittering like shards of glass beneath the first fragile light of dawn. From the hospital window, the sky shifted into strokes of pale gold and silver, a quiet promise that the worst had passed. Inside, warmth bloomed where only fear had lived. Lily lay curled against her mother, her tiny fingers still laced through Anna's. The rhythm of Anna's heartbeat carried the child into sleep, her face softened with a peace she hadn't known in weeks. Thomas sat nearby, shoulders hunched, tears carving a path down his face. He knew redemption would not come with apologies, it would be earned, step by step, beginning here in this sterile room where truth had finally demanded its due. Anna's eyelids fluttered shut again, but not from weakness. Her lips curved faintly, as though after years of shadows she had finally reclaimed her breath. Michael stood in the hallway, exhaling the storm that had weighed on him since the night began. The case was far from over. Valerie would stand trial. Evidence would surface. But justice had already been set in motion. Rex shifted at Anna's bedside, chest rising and falling, amber eyes unblinking. He would not rest until he knew the fight was finished. To everyone else, he was only a dog. But that night had proved otherwise. He was the sentinel who never faltered, the silent guardian who refused to let lies bury the truth. And then, just as dawn poured its light across the snow, Lily stirred awake. A trembling smile broke across her face as her mother's hand squeezed hers back. It was a moment fragile enough to shatter with the smallest breath, until the sudden slam of a door down the hall cracked the silence. Michael's head snapped up, footsteps echoed, hurried, wrong. Valerie had tried to slip her cuffs, and chaos erupted before the sun had fully risen. Rex was the first to move. A flash of muscle and fur, he bolted toward the sound, his growl splitting the air like thunder. Officers shouted, boots pounded on tile. In that instant, the fragile piece of morning became a battlefield once more. But where fear had once ruled, now stood courage. The Parker family's dawn would not be stolen again. Justice, though shaken, stood unbreakable. And when Valerie was dragged away for the last time, snow outside blazing under a defiant sun, it was clear. Some storms end, not in silence, but in the roar of truth finally breaking free. Sometimes, the darkest nights give birth to mornings no one could imagine. And sometimes God's miracles arrive not in lightning, but in the loyalty of a dog, the courage of a child, and the unyielding strength of a mother's love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. And remember, when the night feels endless, dawn may be only one brave act away.